All right, so there were a lot of questions about Section 7. The first one was what were the characteristics of Protestant Christianity in the 19th century in China? And there was the Protestants had wanted to enter China. And this was not necessarily going to be an easy process because the Catholics, of course, were already there. They were just trying to hang on, and the idea that the Chinese government would just welcome another group of Christians to come in is just not very realistic. And in addition, the Qing dynasty, China wanted to keep them out, right? They saw Christianity as a dangerous threat to their traditional way of life, challenged basic kind of concepts about Chinese religion, as we saw before with the ancestor rights controversy involving Catholics. And Protestants were pretty much in agreement in many respects on that. However, what's going to change in the 19th century is that the Western nations have undergone a kind of industrial revolution. And so they're going to be much more powerful than Qing Dynasty China. And you may remember I talked about, during the Opium War, the British had like just a couple steamships, and these were able to help them to just utterly defeat the Chinese military very easily. So the growing power of the West in the 19th century, particularly Great Britain and the United States, will allow for Protestant missionaries to increasingly be allowed into China. And in particular, after the Opium War in the 1830s and early 1840s, China will be forced to sign treaties that allow missionaries to work in its ports, right? That China will have to open certain ports to trade, and missionaries will get the right to work there. So on to question 2, what led to the outbreak of the Taiping Rebellion? How was it connected to Christianity? Why did it go from simply being a religious movement to rebellion? How was it different from traditional Christianity? Why did Western Christians reject it? So that's a lot. So for our purposes, right, we need to understand, first of all, that the Taiping Rebellion is very much closely connected to one man, Hong Xiuquan, who was a member of a minority in China, the Hakka. And he was someone who was a scholar and who wanted to become an official. And in this time period in China, the best job to have was to be an official. To become an official, you had to take exams that were based on Confucianism. And he took and failed these exams multiple times. He just had terrible test anxiety. He couldn't even pass the first one. And once when he was in an open port, we just talked about those, he received tracts from a missionary and he put them in his bag and then kind of forgot about them. And then later on, he would take the exam that he was there to take, and he would fail the exam and then return home and have a nervous breakdown. And he had all these weird dreams and visions, and in which he saw an old man who was yelling at Confucius, and there was a younger man who was the old man's younger son or oldest son. And in these visions, Hong Xiuquan was given a sword and told to kill demons with it. And he recovered from this, and he was telling his cousin about these visions he had had. And his cousin had read that missionary tract and said, that old man was God. He was telling Confucius how he was a bad guy and we shouldn't follow Confucianism anymore, which, of course, Hong Xiuquan would have been happy about since he kept following the Confucian exams. And then, that older person, the oldest son of God, that must be Jesus. And in the vision, Hong was told that he was also a son of the old man and the younger brother of the younger man, and so that would make Hong Xiuquan the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And Hong was convinced by this, that this was that he must be the younger son of Jesus, the younger brother of Jesus, and that he therefore had a mission. And this included attacks on Confucianism. And I'm now looking at the slide that says idolatry and empire, and this has some Chinese characters on it, and you could see how Hong Xiuquan this is going to go from just being kind of a religious movement that says Confucianism is wrong to something that's going to become a political movement, right? First of all, Confucianism is part of the political system in China, so just criticizing Confucianism is criticizing politics. But also, what's important to note is that the word for emperor, Huangdi, shared a Chinese character with the word that Protestants used and that Catholics had used earlier before switching to the Lord of Heaven, used to refer to God, meaning Lord on high. And you can see that second character, D, is the same. And in this time period, you were not allowed to have use the emperor's characters in your name. And so applying that principle, Hong was horrified by this because he said, oh my gosh, look, the emperor is using God's name as his own name. That's idolatry, right? You're asking us to worship the emperor as we worship God. And so that kind of sharpened his political critique even further. So he's got this, is not only a religious movement, it's also a political movement. And I'm looking now at the Taiping Rebellion continued slide. And Hong Xiuquan is going to engage in local acts of iconoclasm. He'll go into Confucian temples and destroy ancestor tablets. He'll destroy Buddhist and Taoist statues. And this doesn't make him very popular among some people, but he has a growing number of followers, especially among this Hakka ethnic group. And he lives in a place where the government is very weak, isn't able to protect people. And so he and his religion form a militia, which is not meant to be a rebel army. It's meant to defend them from bandits. But the Qing do eventually send troops to this region to deal with the bandits, and they order the militia to disband. They refuse because, they want to keep the militia around to defend themselves, and they end up fighting with Qing imperial troops, and they defeat them. And this inspires Hong. He says, okay, yeah, that's right. God is blessing our political action against the Qing. It's time to raise a rebellion, and they declare a new dynasty called the Taiping, right? And Taiping is Chinese, meaning great peace. And what's kind of disturbing about this whole thing is that Hong will connect the Manchu people, the ethnic group that rule China. The Qing is the name of the dynasty, and the dynasty just refers to the ruling family. And the ruling family were Manchus, this ethnic group. And Hong says, oh, God gave me a sword to kill demons. The Manchus are the demons, so I need to kill them. So unfortunately, when this group would take a city, they would often single out the Manchus, ethnic Manchus, and massacre them. And this rebellion was huge. They seized the old southern capital called Nanjing. And I'm looking at the map, and you can see they controlled a huge amount of territory. It's also important to note that this lasted for over a decade, this rebellion. So this is a really serious threat. Now, they do come eventually into contact with Western Christians, in particular among a bunch of British soldiers who are Christians. And they ask some questions, and these are questions asked by Hong Xiuquan himself through envoys. And this shows kind of how this is still in many ways a Chinese religion. They ask, how tall is God? What color is God's beard? What sort of clothes does God wear? Was Jesus' first wife our elder sister? How many sons and grandsons does God have? Right? These are kind of complex, kind of questions. And Hong was not happy with the answers that he was given because, of course, they just said, well, God's a spirit. He doesn't do this kind of thing. And they're especially, and I'm looking now at the next clip, next slide, Western rejection of Taiping. They're especially unhappy that they say, well, you can't be the Son of God because Jesus is the only Son of God. And so this leads to a break between the Westerners and the Taiping. And this just continues because when Hong's idea of what Christianity conflicts with the Bible, he just rejects the Bible as corrupted. So, for example, he rewrites the story of Noah, where Noah is seen naked by his sons after he's gotten drunk. He takes out the whole part about Noah getting drunk. He's really disturbed by the idea, the Israelite practice of a brother marrying his brother's wife if he should die without children, because to Chinese that's incestuous. It doesn't matter that was your a sister-in-law is still your sister. And so this divides, any chance that the Christian Westerners would have supported Hong is pretty much gone. And so what's going to happen is we're going to have the Westerners will support the Qing in their effort to suppress this. And especially they like supporting the Qing because they just defeated the Qing in another war, which gives them even more rights. They like the Qing, because they can kind of bully the Qing. And so the Taiping will eventually be defeated by a allied Qing Western force. 20 million Chinese will die in all this, and so nothing is really solved. And so we can kind of understand why the Chinese were so hesitant to allow foreign ideas in, because, they let in Christianity now. They're kind of forced to allow this Protestant Christianity in, and it leads to this massive rebellion that kills a lot of people. So this next question, who is Eva Price? What did she and her husband do in China? What was the relationship between Christian missionaries and empire? How did missionaries and non-Christian Chinese see each other? And this question kind of flows, I think, naturally into question 4. What were the causes of the Boxer Rebellion? Why did it target Christians? What was the course of the rebellion? So Eva Price, remember, was a missionary to China, Protestant missionary, and she went to China with her husband and their young daughter. And they do things in China like establish schools and hospitals. And, from a perspective, modern perspective, hey, that's great. They're bringing modern medical treatment to people. They're bringing education. That's great. But also they're connected to imperialism, because usually the missionaries will go somewhere first, merchants will follow them, and then the U.S. government will follow them. And then this will often lead to clashes between religious believers, Chinese Christians and missionaries versus the non-Christian Chinese. And then the American government or British government or French government will intervene on behalf of either the Chinese Christians or their citizens, right? And so this leads many Chinese who are not Christians to be hostile, to see, this is an imperialistic force, and they're not completely wrong about that, right? So there will be attacks on Christians, not just missionaries, but also especially Chinese Christians, who are seen as kind of like secondary foreign devils, as they would say. And this story connects directly to the Boxers because, and you saw this in Boxers and Saints, you've got these people. You've got a famine in late 19th century, large parts of northern China in the late 19th century, and it's caused by a drought, and people don't have anything to do when there's a drought. If you're a farmer, you're just kind of waiting around for it to rain so you can work. And so people did things like start practicing martial arts, and they started talking about, what's causing this, and looking at this slide now called the problem of rain. This highlights that the fact that there was no rain, that leads to these Boxers getting together and engaging these religious practices. And if we go to the next slide, a Boxer perspective, you can see where it says, okay, the gods are, the reason it's not raining is because these foreign missionaries are here. They're teaching people not to believe in the gods anymore. So we need to deal with these people by getting rid of them, by killing them. And it's interesting because they understand technology. Say, let's cut the telegraph wires so they can't call for help. Let's clear up the railways. Let's get rid of those so that if help can't come, should they call it, and then we can finally get rid of these people. And one thing I want to stress is when they did this, sometimes when they did engage in massacres of Chinese Christians or missionaries, then it would start raining and they would say, oh, okay, I guess we were right to do that. And you can see in this History in Three Keys slide that I won't read all this, but this really emphasizes this idea that these Christians are doing bad things and the gods are punishing us for them. And so we need to get rid of these Christians and then things will get better again. So during the Boxer Rebellion, there are these attacks on missions. These will spread. In fact, all of northern China will kind of go up in arms. In Beijing, the capital, there is a legation area, and this is an area where there is a group of diplomats and a lot of, it's basically like a city within a city, and they fortify it. And it's got walls around it. So they're able to defend themselves. The Chinese Christians, as well as Western missionaries and Western diplomats and Western soldiers, are able to kind of withstand a siege within this city. And then an international army made up of like 8 nations, I think, like Russia, Italy, France, Germany, Japan, the United States, Russia, and Austria will actually invade China and rescue these people here. Though unfortunately for the prices, they are not rescued. They are actually massacred. They never get to Beijing. And these soldiers are very upset about all this, how the Chinese Christians, but especially how the foreigners were treated, and will wreak vengeance. And you saw this in Boxers and Saints. So moving on to Korea, which is in many ways, I guess, kind of a happier story. That we had this first question: how did Protestant Christianity gain tolerance in Korea? And I told you the story of Horace Allen and Min Young-ik. Horace Allen was a medical missionary, but he used being the doctor of the American diplomat in Korea as a cover, right? In Korea, just like in China, Christianity was illegal. Remember, they were persecuting Catholics. And so he's going to use this as his cover, that he's just a medical doctor. And as a modern medical doctor, though, when the Queen's nephew is injured in a coup attempt, he's very severely injured, he's cut up badly by swords, Horace Allen will actually save his life. And this will convince the court, the king and the queen, that maybe these Protestant Christians are good. They can help our country. We should tolerate them, right? And it's like something out of a novel, but it does convince them, like, oh, this Western knowledge is good. It saved my nephew's life. We can trust these people. They're good. Now, who were the Underwoods? What do they tell us about Protestant missionaries' efforts at this time? And the Underwoods, they are... and I'm looking at the Presbyterians in Korea slide. They're both Presbyterians. Reverend Horace Underwood was a ordained minister, and he was married to Dr. Lilius Underwood, a medical doctor. And I like to point this out because it shows, Protestants were very interested in this kind of advanced, not only sending ordained ministers who would preach, but also sending medical doctors. And you could say, this is in a sense a kind of progressive perspective because, this is a female medical doctor, right? She's not a nurse, she's a medical doctor. And what's particularly striking, though, at the same time was when they got married, it was assumed, and this is what she did, was she actually kind of stopped engaging in full-time medical practice, right? She then went to be more of a housewife mother, though she still used her kind of medical knowledge, certainly, and she still acted as a doctor, but it was just understood, well, now that you're married, you need to become a homemaker, right? Reverend Underwood is not going to become a house husband, right? It's the woman needs to kind of leave her career. So there's still some kind of limits to this. Now, looking at the importance of medicine slide, the Presbyterians would work with other Protestants, particularly Methodists, to establish Severance Medical Hospital. And they bring with this idea that they would share the fruits of Western Christian civilization. They believed that the United States and Britain and other predominantly Christian countries were so great because they were Christian, particularly Protestant Christian. And sharing that was a Christian thing to do, right? So they argue our civilization is so advanced, we have science and technology because we're Christian, and we should share it as Christians. And you can kind of see this. This is a quote from the Reverend Horace Underwood, saying that, this hospital will teach Koreans to believe that little medicine properly applied in a case of typhoid fever will do more than the pounding of tambourines or the burning of paper prayers to paper gods. This will convince them that Western science is better and it's a product of Christianity. That will then get rid of their old religion and pave the way for their conversion to Christianity. There were some questions. No one asked any questions about questions 7 through 11, or I'm sorry, 8 through 11. So then that brings us, or 7 through 10. No one asked us any other questions, but there were a couple of questions about the names. So there was Samuel Adjai Crowther. So he was an enslaved West African rescued by the British Navy. He would convert to Christianity you can see, at a very young age. He was only 12. And then he would very quickly, and then 20 years later, in his early 30s, he'd be ordained an Anglican priest after studying in London. And he became the first African Anglican bishop in 1864. So that's kind of a big deal. And he would gain fame as a Bible translator. He would translate the Bible into his native Yoruban language and as an explorer. And it's interesting because his grandson will go on and become a Nigerian independent activist. But one thing I want to highlight about this guy was that he represents a kind of an openness and limitation that was available to Africans, and this would be true for other indigenous peoples when they encounter Christianity. The Anglican Church was quite happy for him to become a bishop and to work among Africans, but they did not want him to have authority over white priests. And he thought he should. He thought, I'm a bishop. I should have the white priests who are serving in my area should be under me. And that was just considered unacceptable. And I'm not picking on the Anglicans. You had this problem in other churches as well. But it shows that they had a kind of openness, but there was still kind of a color barrier here. And that's something to kind of keep in mind. The other person that people ask about was William Wade Harris. So William Wade Harris was a African Christian who was tied to the Methodists and Episcopalians, but because his activities, religious activities, were seen as dangerous, he was thrown in prison. And while in prison, he received a vision of the angel Gabriel and was told he was the last prophet. And I always think that's an interesting story because that's essentially the story of Islam. But here it's happening in a Christian context. He's eventually released, and he goes around preaching his own kind of form of Christianity, where he will, is both kind of destructive and accepting at the same time. He insists that Africans who want to become Christians destroy their old holy items, the things connected to their old religions. In missionary churches, they usually emphasize that you need to go through a period of probation and study and learning before you're baptized. He would just baptize people immediately. And the reason he did that was he believed that baptism gave people a kind of power to protect them from from evil spirits. And so this was important because Africans were being asked to turn away from their old religion. And for them to do that, they need to be given a new defense, right, against the evil spiritual forces that they believe continue to exist, right? And baptism would do that. So the problem with what missionaries were doing was they were asking Africans to get rid of their old religious ties that they saw as protecting them from a hostile spiritual world without giving them anything to protect them. He also gained reputation as a healer, and he was fairly tolerant of polygamy, which was a common practice in the areas where he worked. Now, what's important about him is while there was formation of independent Harris churches, he didn't do that. He just urged his followers to join mission churches, and this led to the growth of many mission churches, and it also prevented him from getting thrown back in jail.